Good afternoon and welcome to the Center for Urban Education. My name is Shalegra Moy and I lead the Heinz Fellows program here at the Center for Urban Education. And I'm also a doctoral student in the Urban Education program. I am really excited to be here today, and I'm excited for all of you all who have joined in for this Lunch and Learn. You will not be disappointed. For those of you all who are new to the Center for Urban Education, our vision is to learn from and with communities, to share our research findings and service to communities, and to transform educational opportunities and experiences. And one of the ways that we do that here at CUE is through events such as today's Lunch and Learn. And today we have our scholar practitioner, Dr. Connie with us here today. I would be remiss if I did not mention how timely Dr. One's visit is with us here today, as she is a researcher, author, trainer, and educator whose work is really a reflection of her lifelong commitment to ending racial and gender-based violence. And in light of what transpired in Atlanta, that was racialized and gender-based violence, I'm just very grateful to Dr. One to come here and share with us today a visit that was already planned some time ago. And my thoughts and prayers are, with you as you share and give of yourself with us here today. Dr. One is actually going to be joined in conversation with our own Dr. Sabina Vaught, who is our inaugural chair of the Teaching, Learning, and Leading Department here in the School of Education. And so I am going to go silent for a while here, but I'll come back at the end of their dialogue. And so Dr. One and I will facilitate audience questions that come in through our Facebook stream and also through this live webinar. And so again, I just want to say thank you to our guests. Thank you to our esteemed colleagues and scholars who are here with us today. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Dr. Vaught, who will also leave us once Dr. One and I go into the Q&A part of today's Lunch and Learn.
Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Shalegra, for that lovely introduction to today and Dr. One. Before we get going, I just want to thank Cassia Krogan, who is behind the scenes and made it possible for all of us to be together today. Sueño Viveros, who planned Dr. One's visit, and Elon Dancy, who's the executive director of CUE, and he'll come on at the end to talk to everyone. But I want to thank him for the invitation to join today, and also really for the vision that makes this series so powerful. So Connie, thank you for being with us today, and particularly in this time. And thank you for being with me. I'm excited to talk to you in this way. I think the last time we talked in this, well, we weren't on Zoom, but we talked in this kind of open collective format was spring of 2019. And that was in Oklahoma. And we were with a collective that had been established with people like Kirsten Edwards and Emily Nichols talking about women and girls across a range of social and educational contexts. So I'm glad to be back with you. So you and I had a conversation last week, and one of the things we talked about, and I'm just going to jump right in and then, take this obviously wherever you want to go, but we talked about solidarity and the way in which solidarity really often gets framed through the lens of identity groups, which people from Stuart Hall to Catherine McKittrick have invited us to complicate and trouble. And in our conversation, you and I thought about the ways in which revolutionary solidarity has been organized or framed through common purpose. And I'm wondering if you'd think about that tension with us a little bit, this sort of identity framework, the common purpose practice, and where those are maybe in tension or alignment, or move us to ask other questions.
So, yes to the question. I also want to thank Cassia and Sueño and Dr. Dancy for bringing me here today. Thank you, Shalegra, for the introduction. And then, of course, thank you, Sabina. You know, we've been friends for a while and you've been a mentor of mine. So, of course, when you suggested that I come out, I was like, yes, whatever Sabina says. So, I just want to share that and thank you for all of your work. Um, you know, and then also to remind the folks or to contextualize some things for your attendees, which is that, you know, Dr. Vaught and I have known each other for beyond Oklahoma, and I read her book, Compulsive Schooling, Compulsive Schooling, as I was writing. So she's always been a part of the conversations I've had even before I met her. So then now to the question around solidarity, you know, we ended up talking about this in light of everything that is going on, in addition to the work that she and I have both been doing around both the violence of schooling, the violence of incarceration, criminalization, the violence of anti-Blackness as it relates to gender-based violence. So we've long been talking about, you know, revolution or what it means to free people. And then in this period where there is not only an uptick around the violence against Asian community members, but more of concentrated media attention around the violence of against our communities. And then the recent event in Atlanta, where 8 people were killed, 6 of whom were Asian women, most of whom were low-wage workers, migrant workers, massage parlor workers, and sex workers. The issue of solidarity is really important because at the center of solidarity needs to be a focus on the politics of those who are involved in this work to free our communities and free our people. Historically, we've talked about, you know, we've talked about solidarity in the form of identity politics. We saw that, well, we see it in many places. We see it kind of tokenized and used just as like hashtags, right? But solidarity work requires a lot of labor. Solidarity work requires a lot of political education. Solidarity work requires a lot of relationship building. And it requires a lot of what, you know, I keep emphasizing alongside many other abolitionists, the issue or the question of accountability, right? So I want us to think about solidarity in terms of accountability to one another. You know, I have heard different community-based organizations leading the way around this alongside scholars when they talk about transactional solidarity, and then they talk about transformational solidarity. And in their organizing, when they talk about transformational solidarity, they're talking about assessing one's resources, one's needs, and how that relates to another group's resources and their needs, their politics and their political struggles. So I think solidarity, racial solidarity, revolutionary solidarity will require us to be very accountable to one another. It requires the politics that of accountability. And I think it also requires us, you know, I think about, you know, I've been thinking a lot about Sonia Sanchez's one of her poems when it talks about revolution and revolution requiring love and it requiring death. And I think that's actually really central to how I've been thinking about solidarity and political organizing. You know, earlier I talked about assessing our resources and our needs. And I think that it also requires us to give up many things, including our own senses of being. Um, I think about Mia Mingus, who is a disability justice leader and a transformation justice organizer and leader. There's another quote that she mentions, and she says, it's something along the lines of, do you want to give up, like you must give up your desire to be right, because it's about relationship. Do you want to be right, or do you want to be in relation? Do you want to be in a relationship? So I think that's also fundamental to revolutionary solidarity, relationships, and giving many things up in the name of a relationship that is being forged for freedom. So I said a whole bunch of things. So Sabina, please feel free to ask me to follow up or unpack all of that.
So maybe let's follow two threads, one being relationality and one being your gesturing toward labor and the importance of labor in both this current moment and the long life of revolutionary struggle. So I wonder, do you want to start with labor? Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I wonder if this is a place to think about labor as a point of entry for intersectionality, which gets used again. We have this sort of identity theme maybe emerging here, sort of gets used with identity, but you've talked about understanding people's needs, resources, the conditions of their labor in a global context of racial capitalism. So how is labor maybe a point of entry for thinking about the solidarity work and thinking about it through an intersectional framework?
Oh, that's such a great question. And I'm sure someone will write their dissertation based upon this question. Just hope you credit Sabina for that. So I feel like, let me try to tackle labor and then bring in the intersectional part of it, right? And I think a good way of talking about it too is I think I'm going to talk about it from my own labor and see if I can understand things better. So, I, as an organizer, I'll start off saying that when I was young, I was about 17, 18 years old. And as a Vietnamese woman who was born in Oakland, raised throughout the Bay Area, it was a poor working class upbringing. And I was the first person to have been born here, which meant that I spent most of my childhood translating for my family members, for my grandparents, for my aunt, my mom, but mostly my grandparents, because by that time I wasn't living with with my mother and my father. They were, there was a lot of violence. So I was living with my grandparents. And I remember growing up with all kids of color, because I'm in the Bay Area, Oakland to other parts of working class Bay Area. I'm growing up with Black, Latinx, and other kids of color, Asian, Pacific Islander youth. But for Asian kids at the time, at least for me, I didn't have a racial literacy for what it meant to be, Asian in the United States. And what I found myself doing quite religiously, and I've said this in other places, was study Black radical thought. In order for me to understand race in the United States, I read Black feminism quite religiously. I remember finding such an affinity for Toni Morrison's work, for Zora Neale Hurston's work, right? I was fortunate to have a white feminist English teacher who made sure we read all these books, but I found a, quasi pseudo, I say that because I didn't understand my affinity for Black feminism, but it helps me to understand so many things, and I did the labor of reading these other Black women's labor. So I want to start off from there, right? To recognize the labor of others who have done the labor to try to figure out and name what's been going on with the United States in relationship to race and gender violence and migration, right? Forced migration, slavery, right? So then as I was reading and studying, I started thinking through and reading, Huey P. Newton's work. And I remember reading his work, To Die for the People, and literally like, I was highlighting every sentence because I didn't really know how to highlight either, how to read like in chunks. I was just reading everything. And if you look at the book now, you just see just things being re-highlighted over a highlight, right? I was laboring because I wanted to understand what was going on, both for myself, but for my peers. And then as I read more about what was going on with anti-Blackness, though I didn't have that language then, I wanted to understand it even more, right? To understand this country's history, because I wasn't getting it explicitly from the educational system, right? And then I find myself as a youth organizer. Maybe I didn't find myself. I became a youth organizer, and I labored there too. I took the education that I had learned, in school, but also outside of school, in the work of being a youth organizer and being on the streets and trying to apply what I was reading to what was happening with young people in the Bay Area and across the US around criminalization, around access to education. So I think naming that too helps me to think through the intersections of issues, right? Like we are not single issued people. This is not a single issued concern or problem. So here I start thinking about race, gender, violence against youth, and then the roles that community organizers play in laboring for freedom, right? And then I'll share another story, which is that as I was doing this labor of reading and studying, I found myself writing to Yuri Kochiyama. And I think I might have told you this before, Sabina, I'm not sure. But I was writing to Yuri Kochiyama in the early mid-90s. At the time, we were all on AOL. And I was asking her more about questions about prisons and about race. Because at the time, critical resistance was starting to take place. So I'm asking her these questions, and she says, come to visit me in Harlem. So I'm like, Yuri said, come over, right? So I fly from Oakland and I go to her home, and in her home, she was, to the question, working. She was writing letters to people inside of prisons, to Mumia Abu-Jamal, to Assata Shakur. She was writing, and she was having study groups. And I segue is that I was also doing some archival work for Yuri's, I was archiving Yuri's work for one of her friends years ago as well. And when I was archiving her work, one of the things that I saw in her binders was a note. She had gone to a study group the day after Malcolm X died. And she writes at the top of it, Malcolm died yesterday, right? I'm pretty sure it was yesterday or that day. But the point of that was that she was still working and still studying. But more importantly, studying was the labor of understanding what was happening, right? It was a way of her processing, I think, the violence of her friend's death. And she continued that for the rest of her life, writing and studying and drawing connections, right? So I think, to go back to the question of labor, I would hope that we recognize the way that labor plays out in so many parts of our lives, so much of which that is uncompensated labor, right? Unseen labor. And I think that's a part of the violence of capitalism, because only some forms of labor are recognized. right? And only some forms of labor are compensated. And I think what I learned from Yuri too was the labor of relationship building, right? That was her legacy, was building relationships as a part of organizing. And I don't think because of capitalism is anti-relationship. So here we have people who are organizers and educators building relationships as a part of their anti-capitalist, consciously or unconsciously, they're building relationships as a part of their anti-capitalist labor. And then, so I'm talking about labor in these ways, having us reclaim what labor means, I think, or how we understand labor. And then I want us to think through these women in particular last week. When I think through labor, there has been, I've been studying more recently popular discourse around these women's lives. And I have been forced to name and rename what these women did for a living, right? One, because we live in a culture that is very anti-sex work. And we live in a culture that is very racist, that is very sexist, by which there was just this conflated assumption that Asian women who work in massage parlors must all be sex workers. And then there's the pain of people not wanting to be affiliated with sex workers. So having to code switch and account for a different forms of racism and sexism has also been laborious for me. But it also speaks to the myopic ways we understand and will recognize women's bodies and the ways that they labor, right? Going back to these women again, when you look at their stories, for instance, you'll learn that a couple of the women lived in these spas. Media says that one or two of them were working at the front desk. You'll learn from one of the young men who was the son. He's the son of one of the women who was killed. He says, she did what she had to do for a living. And I've cited this before because it was so painful but beautiful to me when he characterized and named his mom's life, or was sharing her life. He said she worked hard and she took us to expensive sushi dinners. She was a single mother of two. And this young man shares he didn't know his dad. And I can't help but to think that this white man who killed her not only because she's an Asian woman, but he killed her for what she did for a living. And then he took away the fruits of her labor, which was to take care of her children. Another form of unrecognized labor. Being able to take care of your children, to provide in ways in an industry that's already stigmatized and criminalized, is another layer of labor, right? It's the work, it's the hiding of it, there's also the shame that I imagine she experienced. One, because I'm also a former sex worker, and I know that stigma and that labor of hiding, right? So I bring that up because there's so many invisible forms of labor, especially for those who sit at the intersections of race, gender, class, sexuality, ableism, age, right? So much labor for those of us who sit at the intersections to not only, there's labor and ways that we have to survive, And then there's the labor of us having to hide the ways that we live. There's labor in not being in trying to assert our livelihoods to be recognized. And then there is the labor, I think, for those of us who are doing the work, who sit at the intersections, who are doing the work for collective liberation and freedom, there is that unseen labor of building relationships and seeing one another. But that unseen labor is so important and vital and critical that, to me, at some points, I'm not sure I want them to see us as a part of our survival. But I want people to know that labor is happening everywhere, it just seeps through the cracks as a part of our survival, and capitalism can't, and sometimes it can't, we won't be surveilled, right? So I'm going on a tangent really quickly because I keep thinking about the capitalism's need to quantify everything. And a part of our labor is unquantifiable. And some of it is to resist the impulse, the capitalist impulse to quantify, right? So I don't know if that made sense, but there's power, there's violence in the invisibility, and then there's power in the invisibility, I think, is what I'm trying to get at in terms of our labor. Did that make sense, Sabina?
Absolutely. And thank you, because you just beautifully did the labor of storying all the work, the relational work of revolution, and sort of the, you told the story, I think, of what people in political education try to convey, that revolution isn't about fame and the spotlight and publicity. Solutions really were undertaken by people whose names now are only known to their maker. Like, they're not in some recognizable archive. They're not sort of in a spotlight. And I think you so generously, and I appreciate that, did this public labor of storying that really private, fundamental relationship work. So thank you.
Thanks for saying that. Oh, yeah.
So you pointed to something that I wonder if this might be connected to the building of or the work of relationships that's at the heart of any kind of being human. Mm-hmm. and that is the heart of revolution. And you sort of pointed to the way in which commentary or questions, or whether it's as you pointed to, mainstream news media discourse, or it's people who are kind of rallying to address what they recognize as structural ongoing harm. But there's this in the immediate aftermath of these really brutal, violent eruptions that are really just moments of ongoing violence. There's this often this push for legal redress, remedy. And so the push, of course, to have legal sanction against a murder, but also there's a lot of immediate attention to hate crime legislation. This is why we need hate crime legislation. Or there's push to think about the criminalization or decriminalization or legalization of sex work or related kind of labors. But the movement, even sort of from more progressive corners tends to be toward law in some form. And I wonder if you can think aloud with us here about how that actually fits into a deep understanding of relationships between people, between communities, as you suggested, who really will build true solidarity around recognizing needs, resources, struggle, and then frameworks for anti-capitalism or abolition, or the both together.
Mhm. So, I've been feeling that impulse quite a bit around like countering the reliance, the over-reliance, or it feels very compulsive, right? This compulsive reliance upon the criminal justice system to atone for or tend to the harms that have been done against communities. Now, to me, there is something, I do want to hold the state accountable. I'm not against that. You are accountable, number one, because there's all these tax dollars that keeps going to you all. And I know that's my money, right? So I'm like, either give it back or you need to attend to what I said I want you to do this with, right? Just got at a basic level. And then I think through the role of the state in committing all these acts of violence, and I want them to stop. Right. So if I'm going to be in community with the state, number one, I don't really want the state in its form as a white supremacist, anti-Black, patriarchal, ableist, transphobic structure. When I name the state as these systems, when I name the state as these systems, I think of the criminal justice system as one facet, one of its, one of the state apparatuses, right? If the criminal justice system is white supremacist and anti-Black and ableist and sexist, right? Actually, I won't even say if, because it is these things, right? We cannot rely on it. And yet people compulsively do. And what I'm noticing now, and I'm sure your attendees know this, but the violence against Asians in particular in this moment is being used, I see quite clearly, especially by politicians and the police, to undermine Black-led political movements, to defund the police, to end police violence against or to abolish police, right? So their investments in ending anti-Asian violence seem relatively new to me, right? To the extent that it works to extend it. And to provide some context, here in Oakland, when some of the violence was taking place in Chinatown, it's important for people to know that the police station is literally 2 blocks away. And so when the violence got more attention, suddenly there was a mobile police station right in the middle of Chinatown. Oakland mayor decided to say that the reason why this violence was happening was because some of the city council members were trying to defund police, right? So they're putting all of this violence that is systemic, as you mentioned, that has been ongoing, that they neglected to attend to, and putting it on Black-led movements, which is a part of the violence against Asians, because we keep getting used as these wedges. And that doesn't mean that people are not voluntarily subscribing, but I see the state and the criminal justice system using the violence against community members in order to extend itself, right? So going back to your point around hate crime legislation and the compulsive desire for that recognition, it speaks to the hegemony of the state and the way it penetrates our psyche and the way it penetrates our ethos, right? By which we are now consensually or through coercive consent giving up that agency for what would constitute violence and justice for us, right? That's a part of the hegemony, the way that it folds into the state. Our needs are now folded right into the state, right? I've been talking to people about why hate crime legislation is not useful, right? Number one, I say things like the state doesn't get to define for me or others what violence is or what justice is. They too long have a monopoly on these definitions. Not to mention they're perpetrators of violence, right? So most of the progressive communities do not seek hate crime legislation to attend to the violence because we know the violence of the state. Then the second point is proving something as a hate crime is also impossible, right? That's an uphill battle. And I don't know, I understand why people are doing it, but I'm like, why would you expend your energy this way when you could be expending your energy towards community-based accountability, towards long-term strategies, towards us taking care of each other, right? I think those of us who are on the ground doing community organizing and those of us who are educators are trying to shift the narrative away from the state to come back to the community, to come back to revolution, to come back to relationships, so that we can take care of each other and not put it back on a state apparatus that has been harming us. So I don't know if that addressed your question.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks for asking it.
Yeah. I wonder if we can extend that question a little bit into thinking about state-sanctioned gender-based violence, which we might argue is all gender-based violence, but across groups of women sort of encountering different dimensions of that violence or defining it differently. And so I'll give you a quick example. Some collaborators and I just recently wrote about Savannah's Act, which went through the House and the Senate in September, October, early fall. And this was an act purporting to be addressing MMIW and was brought to Congress maybe 2017. So 4 years ago or so, but was reintroduced by Murkowski from Alaska. And it of course went through with great support, because one of the things the act does is say, we, federal government, have to address this horrific, I believe actually they called it an epidemic, but I could be making that up, pattern of violence against Indigenous women. And we need to put our resources behind this. And the way we're going to do that is to direct revenue to quote unquote law enforcement. So county, state, federal policing agencies. And moreover, that one of the contingencies for tribal nations in receiving this supportive resource from the federal government is to share databases on all tribal citizens. So you have a moment where a self-described MMIW is coming out of self-determined communities, describing a pattern of gender-based violence, is being co-opted by the federal government to redirect and expand policing in a moment where there are calls for the defunding or abolition of city police. And doing it in a nation to nation context. So I wonder if you could help us think about the ways in which gender-based violence, which gets created by these structures, as you've said, continued by the support of structures, state and state citizens, but gets then co-opted as a benevolent, sort of protective, paternalistic reason to expand the powers of the state. And is there a way to connect that both around the specifics of migration, of sex work, of labor in massage parlors, and sort of other points of state and private gender-based violence? That was a winding question.
No, I appreciate that question, and it made me, and thank you for naming the co-optation. So I can't wait to read the article. That'll be helpful. I think this has been a long-standing problem, right? Even with the Violence Against Women Act, where in the Violence Against Women Act, which we've had to kind of, especially under the Trump administration that didn't want this act, people had to fight in order to be recognized for funding for all of these different sexual violence, rape crisis center, domestic violence centers who need support, right? So we're trying to get money from the state to fund these important centers. But always in these acts by the state includes a whole lot more money for the police, federally and statewide, every single time, right? So again, I think there were a couple thoughts that I had. One is the violence of the state is in part seen through the ways, experienced through the ways that it takes the violence against communities in order to feed itself, right? It takes the harms that are being done against community members that it helped to create. It distances itself from being implicated in the violence by naming itself as our benevolent protectors. So it never implicates itself and says, hey, I've done this harm. In fact, we actually shouldn't be here because this is native land, right? Like it never does that. It made itself as a part of its long legacy of missionary, benevolent identity and politics, right? I don't think, even as I talk out loud with you about this, it's a part of its longstanding history. This is a part of the United States' longstanding history of its criminal justice system, formally and informally, to bring itself to another space, name itself a benevolent protector, and then increase its own resources, right? Meanwhile, negating and implicating everyone else as purveyors of violence, as perpetrators. Everyone else is a perpetrator of violence, not it, right? So then it not only co-ops it, right? It co-ops the violence against us and the work that our communities have been doing, folds itself in as a part of itself, as a part of the violence. It's a white supremacist, anti-Black, anti-Indigenous, sexist, like strategy, right? Like even if you like simplify it, I think of some of that, even my like white woman neighbor who is so racist will just like take up all this space. The other day she hit my car And I was like, can I get your insurance? She started crying. And somehow she was the victim, right? And it just took away, like there's this propensity to just take away what harm we just experienced, I just experienced, and centers herself. So I'm not necessarily like personalizing it, but I'm recognizing the way that white supremacy works. It just takes your things and makes it its own, and then decides they're going to protect you. Nowhere do we get consent in this. So to your the verbs you used, it's co-opting, and then it also like re-victimizes in the invisibilization as it feeds itself, right? So I think through the connections between the state and capitalism, the marginalization, the violence, it's a violent apparatus, and it does it everywhere to communities of color differently, but it does it everywhere, right? So I want to name that, and then I think, well, I'll just leave that there. You made another point, and I just forgot because I didn't write it.
I forgot.
But it's so, and even for our attendees who are in the field of education, right? I will be bold enough to say a couple of things. One is that, I was on a call yesterday with a good friend of mine who was formerly incarcerated, and a good friend of Yuri Kochiyama's. She was actually trying to free him when I first met him. His name is Eddie Zhang. So we're in this conversation. And one of the things that Eddie said was, a lot of the people who were incarcerated, and he named the percentage, are dropped out of school, have this high, have this literacy rate that people always mention. And so the solution that many people say is to funnel money from the prisons, investments in prisons, into education, right? And so in that moment, again, as a former school teacher, someone who's worked in prisons and who does this research, I had to ask him to pump his brakes, and everyone on the call. And I was like, first, we have to recognize that the educational system is a white supremacist one. It's an anti-Black one. It's a sexist one. It's not coincidental that people didn't know these histories about chattel slavery, anti-Asian violence. It's not a coincidence, right? It ignored our history and our analysis on purpose, right? Not conspiratorially, but it just doesn't fit its narrative, right? So I said to my colleagues, I was like, the educational system is white supremacist, and you have to acknowledge that some of the young people who have dropped out of school, we have to honor their impulse. So yes, there are issues and societal concerns around our young people's well-beings, enough to be sitting in class for 6 hours, right? Well, we have to recognize their impulse and their intuitions in a classroom that doesn't reflect their needs or doesn't tell their story correctly. And so I was concerned by that point, because I don't want us, again, to funnel one source of revenue to another violent institution that is a part of the white supremacist anti-Black, system that we're all living under. It keeps feeding itself while the rest of us are hungry, right? So so it is about co-opting, but it's also about taking, right? It's a long-standing history of stealing. Yeah. Like, I just feel like just naming it, you just keep stealing. And never are you ever implicated in that violence. Yeah.
Stealing and extraction to support the continuation of that violence. Yeah.
Yeah, I really appreciate that too. Because when we were talking, we've been talking about this. It's an extraction of our resources, extraction of our bodies, Black bodies, extraction of our labor, extraction of, our stories,
Mhm.
right? Extraction of our work.
Mhm.
That's a part of the violence. And always without our, I won't say always, but for the most part, without our consent, you know. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for pivoting to schooling, because I think that connects that relationship and the logic of that relationship to everything we've been talking about in ways that people, often resist and when they're in the system. So I appreciate you're making that connection, and it's also a perfect segue because it looks like we have questions rolling in, and we have about 35 minutes left. So this is a good time for us to wrap our conversation, and Shalegra will come back. No.
No,
And
not, I'm like, no, Sabina, don't leave.
oh,
And
yeah.
and I, because she said end, and I want us to all be together. That's it. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I can stay. But thank you. Thank you for the conversation. Thank you for your generosity and your insights today. Always, I learn so much when I'm talking with you. So thank you.
Thanks. I hope it was helpful. I know you're always ahead of thinking. So I appreciate it. I love you.
Love you too. Here's the fabulous Shalegra.
Wow. I love you both.
Love you too.
I am so full, and so very thankful and grateful for this opportunity to be in community with you both right now. But I'm going to get to these really great questions that the audience has posed. And the first question that has come in for you, Dr. One, is if you could talk more about what you mean when you say we need to take care of each other. Where does this fit in to addressing the problems that you described?
Sure, that's a great question. Let me pause real quick. Sabina, thank you for staying on. I know you heard me say don't leave, but you don't have to stay if you don't want. But I appreciate you taking care of me, me saying that. You don't have to. Okay. So log off disappear or whatever you want, whenever you want. I think, shall I go to the question around taking care of each other? So let me put that into a political context first, right? In the work that people are doing for abolition and to defund the police, a lot of us are saying things, or not only saying, but we are working on mutual aid projects, right? We're working on transformative justice as a part of the work to defund and abolish prisons and police. So when I say mutual aid, there are many scholars who are doing this work, who are leading the work to theorize and help us to better understand mutual aid. That includes Dean Spade. I know that Dylan Rodriguez is doing some stuff around that. Miriam Kaba has long been doing this work around mutual aid. Mutual aid is essentially taking care of each other, right? So that we don't have to rely on the state, which has harmed us. And in practice, what that looks like, here in Oakland, in East Oakland, there was a neighbor who literally just had a table out where people could leave all kinds of food. And those who wanted the food or needed the food could come and take that food, and they could just take care of themselves. So it was trading, and there's no requirement for you to give back to that if you cannot, or you are not able, right? Or don't want to, rather, right? Or not capable. But maybe you'll do that later on. You'll use your resources and do it later on. You'll give back later on, right? It's important to share that somebody called the police on this table. there would be no reason. But somebody called the police on this table, and they had that table at least months ago. They had it removed, right? Because it didn't fit zoning or whatever it is. But these are ways that people are building mutual aid projects all across New York, in cities, in Philadelphia. People they have community refrigerators, right? Where people are stocking these refrigerators with food and resources, and you can come and grab things that you need and then restock as you're able, right? Those are forms of mutual aid. There's mutual aid projects where folks are, providing services for those who were more vulnerable than others, especially during the pandemic, right? So there are resource directories for our elderly community members who may need food drop-offs. That's mutual aid, right? Our disabled communities who may need assistance getting places or things delivered. There's a resource directory for that. Mia Mingus, who I mentioned earlier, disability justice, transformative justice leader around this, helps us to understand pod mapping, right? By pod mapping, it's essentially you create pods for people you can call on, and you can call on before there's a need or when there's a moment of crisis and need. So you find your few people, you're in conversation with each other so that if there's something that you need, or you're going to be harmed, or you've been harmed, you can contact them. Right? So these are ways that people are formally committing themselves to mutual aid projects. Now, we all know, I'm seeing people nod I'm seeing you nod your head. And for me, I know mutual aid is to be a good person and a good friend, right? It's like if Sabina says, I need you to do this, I'm like, okay, let me fly on over. If I have the resources, I'll go over there and help Sabina, right? My neighbors, when things happened, with COVID, I immediately started a text line, which was like, if you all need anything, let's take care of each other. People started dropping off groceries at each other's doorsteps if we were going to the grocery store, right? Is being that kind of accountable to each other, right? So those are mutual aid and forms of taking care of each other. And then there's, the political impulse behind that is to not rely on a system that has harmed us and each other, right? So does that help?
Well, it helped me, and I hope it helped our poser. I took notes, so maybe they can contact me. Question number 2, how might the recent femicidal violence and critiques of the state that you've raised help us think about what should be done about state schools? If schools are conduits for state and colonial violence, how might we begin to do work that is toward freedom?
Sabina, I would welcome your thoughts too, by the way. Let me do 2 things. One is go back to that first question for a second and talk directly around gender-based violence too. Most folks who are survivors of violence do not call the police. Most of us do not. We don't for a number of reasons, but we also have long relied on each other for support. And I think that's important. So often people call on the state to speak on behalf of the survivors. And many times, especially if you're a survivor of color, Black woman, Indigenous woman, immigrant woman, you end up being a survivor of then state violence, right? Very often that happens, right? We see that especially if you have issues of disability or disabled community members. Family members call the police thinking that there will be some help, and then something else happens. So here in Oakland and in other parts of the US, people have started to create, not started, but they have amplified and developed mental health crisis units that are community-based. That's a form of taking care of each other, right? In Chicago, there's a group, I forgot their names because I was following them for a long time, but they were their own physical health, like they were their own mobile, they were providing physical, it was like a hospital on wheels, but it was community-based. I didn't know the technical term, so I just called it hospital on wheels. So in Chicago, they have this in Southside Chicago because the police weren't coming in time. So Black women created this system to take care of community members and be able to literally stitch people up. So there are these projects that have been going on because we have not been able to rely on the police, or the police have caused harm. So I just wanted to share that with your attendee who asked the question. And then to go back to the role that schools play in, what the attendee called femicide, right? Like, what can schools do? Was that the question, essentially?
Essentially, and more specifically, with schools as conduits, right, of that state violence and femicidal violence. What can we do to work towards freedom, either within those schools, or I would even offer outside of those existing school systems?
Yeah, so I appreciate that question. One is let's start with a couple of things. I want to add to that question and talk about it as racialized femicide, racialized gender-based violence, right? Because we have to look at the intersections, because not everyone is being harmed in the same way, even if everyone is vulnerable to harm, right? Only some bodies, particular bodies, are being violated and are dying. That doesn't mean that people are not all subject to it. Some bodies are being violent, some bodies are dying. And I don't mean some bodies, right? Two words. So given this context, I think Sabina and I have talked about this, and this is the work that we do in our scholarship, actually, is first, I'm pausing because I don't know if people are ready for me, what I'm going to say. I would abolish schools, not in the kind of white anarchy way, but within the framework of prison and police abolition. It is to abolish the state because of what the state does and is. And in the steps to abolishing it, I want us to think about what that means, right? I think about an educational system that has an intersectional analysis of the world at large across its curriculum. Another educational system, one that centers the frameworks of those who've been harmed by the United States. There are tons of educators and curriculum developers who are of color. We should all be coming together and creating an entirely different educational system. There's enough of us. I don't want us to have to tinker with the educational system that they gave us. I want us to be able to create it, right? Like we have all these tools, all of these frameworks, all of these experiences that should be at the center of a new way of being. right? I believe in that. Like, you can call me utopian, you can call me whatever, but I'm like, I'd love for Sabina to be, sitting with Shalegra and all of us planning this different schooling system, this different school system, a different curriculum that asks the questions that Sabina just asked to me and then answers them accordingly. Right? Centers in intersectional analysis, centers the stories of our communities and our analyses and our vision for a new world. Because essentially the school system is creating a world. And it's a world that continues to harm us. So I'm over here like, you can have that. I'm ready for something else. You know what I mean? Because the work has been done. The thinking, the scholarship, the knowledge system, the production of knowledge is already here. I cited the books I read when I was 19. You know what I mean? That should be at the centerpiece of a new educational system. That's how I feel. But it's learned how I'm feeling. Like, I learned this comes from.
Touche. Lunch and learn. That's what we're all here to do. Thank you for that. Question number 3. Please chat with us a little bit about your work on disciplinary violence in schools against Black girls and other girls of color. Specifically, folks are looking for you to share what you've learned from the work. And what is the community building that you're currently engaged in, and how might others get engaged?
So, sorry, I was pausing on the last question because I wanted to see how Sabina felt about it, because we've been working on things together. So, Sabina, can you hold off on your thought and tell me what you think later around what I just said? Okay. Because I'm like, Sabina, what do you think of this idea? So, okay, and the disciplinary violence about my work, that's central to everything that I'm doing, by the way. So when the question was, can I talk more about that work? Okay. Okay. So when I was doing, first, it comes from that scholarship that their folks are referencing, comes from my work both in prisons, gender-based violence organizing, and it comes from my experience as a school teacher. That's what informed my scholarship. And what I noticed in my work around prisons was how people didn't talk about women who were incarcerated. They barely talked about girls who were incarcerated, barely talked about gender, still don't talk about gender nonconforming trans communities that are incarcerated. So when they talked about the violence of prisons and policing, very rarely did they center the experiences of women and girls, gender nonconforming communities, right? Rarely did they ever talk about Black women, Black girls, when they're talking about police and prisons. So when I was doing my work around schools, and when I was a school teacher, so much of the harm that I was seeing and that I was seeing for my girls happened to Black girls, right? So I taught at a continuation school, which is a school where the students are, on the verge of getting kicked out of the system. And I taught at this school where literally it's an alternative school. So we were in class from 8 to 12. And then sometimes afterwards we were, we had different sessions after school, right? But this school was located next to a cemetery, literally physically located next to a cemetery. So when you go to school, you drive by the cemetery. And when you look over the fence, you see the cemetery. None of that, of course, is by coincidence. the conventional school was next to a really nice neighborhood, so it gets kind of, immersed in a neighborhood feeling. In the continuation school, the neighbors are not alive for the most part. Well, there are other neighbors, but anyways. So I would process this a lot as a school teacher, right? Who again worked inside prisons and was doing organizing. I would process this a lot as a school teacher. And then I would process a lot what my young girls were experiencing, which was a lot of death in their families and in their neighborhoods and towards them. A lot of death and a lot of violence that was not accounted for. Like the school would just expect the young people and the girls to just go on with their day, right? So we didn't offer them any resources. We didn't even acknowledge their suffering, which is a part of what I think, Saidiya Hartman's work helps me to really think about this, right? Black women as not being capable or not society's removal of her access to injury, right? She doesn't get access to injury. So I thought about that as when I was with my students, I saw how we didn't seem to give a damn about what was happening. We cared more about the curriculum, consciously or unconsciously, right? So then when I'm doing this research on discipline, it was Black girls who were getting harmed by the discipline policies. Other girls of color were also subject to discipline, but what I noticed was Black girls were overrepresented in the discipline data, but they were also being subject to other forms of discipline and violence and punishment that was not registered in the discipline data, right? So I saw even more at a larger scale what I saw as a teacher, which is that the girls were being neglected, the girls were being humiliated. And the key thing that I saw too, were these girls were not dropping out of school. They were staying in school, being subject to the violence, which is, I think, a part of the violence. So that was when I started thinking about expanding the need to understand schools as sites of violence, particularly for Black girls. Because again, the invisibility of the violence against her and the labor she has to enact in order to survive it is unrecognized, right? She's surviving the violence. So I love Monique's work around push out, and she and I have been on panels together, but I want to think through, like, a lot of the women and girls that I know and transgender nonconforming communities who are in the schools, particularly Black girls, they're survivors of violence, of state violence. They're survivors and they're still in it. You know what I mean? So I want us to really think about that. Folks out here having whole PhDs surviving the violence. Folks are surviving the violence of going through a doctoral program that negates, that invisibilizes, that humiliates, that ignores, that disciplines, that punishes. Folks are surviving it right now. We don't have to wait for folks to be pushed out. These folks are in there surviving the state. So that to me was a part of the how I understood discipline and punishment in schools where Black girls are its primary targets.
I just need to take a minute to say thank you for what you just shared. And it touched me, and I didn't even expect it, right? But how you talk about Black girls and women, like just in this lifetime pattern of surviving the state, like in pursuit of degrees and promotions and all these other things. And it's just, it's a story I know very well personally, as a Black woman and, through my work in K-12 space. So thank you for that. One of the questions whew, that came up is asking about how you have made the decision or what has inspired your decision to do your advocacy, to do your research outside of the academy, outside of the university.
So Shalek, I just want to recognize you sharing. And I think it is really important to know the educational system as a site of violence. We have to name it that. And then I hope that by doing that, we acknowledge the survivorship, the survivors, people who are surviving it, because it's a lot. It is a lot. It's a lot. It's a lot of pretending that you're not being harmed. It's a lot of pretending that you're not being harmed in order to make it through. And I honor what you were saying, the pursuit of these degrees and, one, I think it's also the pursuit, for many, it's the pursuit of knowledge. So I want us to honor that. It's the pursuit of knowledge and of making sense, right? We're trying to find the words and then we're trying to convey them. Let me convey them correctly because deep inside this doesn't feel right. You know what I mean? So it's like, let me do that digging. And that's for many people's experiences, I think, and then there's also, I fell victim to it. It's the whole okey doke of it. Like, I swore I was going to be a professor. I swore. So that's the answering your colleague's question is like, what made me choose? I'm like, to be honest, they had hurt me way too much. Man. I come as an organizer into academia, right? I also come as a survivor. I also came into academia as a former sex worker. I say this because half the things those white men said, and I've said this in public platforms before, not even half, 97,000% of the things that these white men said to me, number one, you would have had to pay me to articulate. I would have charged you for saying the shit that you said. And I had to stomach it. I had to stomach sexual harassment, right? I forced myself somehow, I unconsciously, because I was in pursuit, right? I thought I needed that degree so badly that I stomached a white man during one of my job talks. A white man said to me, and now that I'm not in academia, I will call you a white man. So the white man said to me, I'm at a job talk and this white man sits across the table from me in front of all other professors. And he says, I used to get Thai massages. This is a job talk for a position, but it doesn't even matter that it was like during a job talk. He's all around just an awful subject, right? He says as nobody intervenes. And then he tells me, and I'll be upfront and frank, right? Where he says, you know, he describes the actual massage, and then he punctuates it with, Thai women are so small, but they're so strong. That was the last job talk I went on. And I went back to my friends who were senior colleagues. And I say friends because it's important, or they were my allies. And I told them what happened. And they were like, you can't report it because you're on the market. And it had become a part of the cycle, right? I had then, so I share that personal experience because it wasn't that I had chosen, this place doesn't give you many choices, right? So let's be clear around choice, right? Hegemony is a real thing. So I left academia in order to survive, right? Some give me some semblance of choice. Give me some semblance of choice. Let me perform choice. And that looks like me leaving you all and going into a lot of debt, more debt, because I'm living off of my credit card, right? With a PhD from UC Berkeley, having been its commencement speaker, with an NSF, with the chancellor's degree or chancellor's fellowship. Like you left me in debt as a part of, and I'm going to name that, I know we got a few, I don't even know how this came up, but it takes from you, you know what I mean? It extracts your labor and then expects you to be grateful. I'm like, what? Anyways, so that's why I'm not there.
Ooh, thank you for that detour, which I know folks appreciated, even though we did not get through all of our questions. Oh my goodness. Thank you so very much, Dr. One. At this time, I'm going to invite our own Dr. Elon Dancy, who is the Dr. Helen S. Faison Endowed Chair and Director of the Center for Urban Education here at Pitt, and also the Associate Dean for Equity and Justice, to close us out with some final remarks.
Yes, thank you so much, Shalegra. My goodness, we must sit with this. This was so much today in our Lunch and Learn. It was a morning, not MORNING, but MOURNING, a truth-telling and a loving. And when I think about love in this sense, I think about the James Baldwin quote about, we're not talking about love in terms of the infantile Americanized sense of being made happy, but in terms of quest and daring and growth. And that's when that's what I think of when I think about what has transpired here today. So just thank you to everyone. I want to take this moment to more specifically thank Dr. Connie One for her thoughtful mind, her intellectual labor here, her freedom work, as well as our interlocutor, our department chair of Teaching, Learning, and Leading, Dr. Sabina Vaught. She offered really generous comments about my vision in the center, but she's a treasured collaborative thinker and visionary in her own right. I just want to say that. The center is grateful for Connie and Sabina's generative conversation about solidarity, intersectionality, and labor, among other topics, essential to thinking about education as a practice of freedom. And thanks to our graduate student chair moderator, Shalegra Moy. If you're just joining us for the first time, I want to re-emphasize the Center for Urban Education's mantra is learn, share, and transform. Learning speaks to the knowledge we produce. Share speaks to our efforts to share what we know and provide forum for our colleagues to do the same, such as this event, but also our aspirational vision of mutual aid. Transform speaks to our purpose. We are interested in transforming education structures, which requires attention to power and power relations. Our thanks to our center team, particularly Castia Krogan and Sueño Viveros for their care of this event, and our supportive dean, Dr. Valerie Kinlock. Join us next week when we will welcome Russell Rickford, Associate Professor of History at Cornell University and author of We Are an African People, Independent Education, Black Power, and the Radical Imagination. Finally, know that we regularly update our website. Go to cue.pitt.edu to sign up for our listserv so you can receive news about our events and other projects. While you're on our website, check out our recent newsletter where you can read about our research, teaching, and service. Thanks so much for attending today. Take good care and be safe. Bye.
Thank you.